Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm really excited to bring you today's video. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's get started. Berlin, 1961. On a cold morning, the city was as chaotic and noisy as usual. Berlin, a city that had yet to recover from the scars of war, was on its way to becoming a part of the modern world. Friedrich and Lucas were two brothers who had grown up in the streets of this city, sharing the deepest bond with each other. They were not just siblings, but also each other's closest friends. They spent their days together running through the streets, with nothing they didn't share. As the people who knew each other best, they were the most trusted individuals in one another's lives. But that day, something was about to change the fate of Berlin. The city's peace was suddenly disturbed. That morning, as Friedrich and Lucas stepped outside their home and made their way in different directions through the city, they both felt something strange. In the western part of Berlin, not far from the border with East Berlin, the first foundations were being laid for the Berlin Wall. The brothers instantly sensed that everything was about to change, but there was one thing they knew for sure. Berlin would now be divided into two. And this was not just a geographical division, but also a point where people's lives and fates would cross. After that morning, everything would proceed in completely different directions. Friedrich had been born and raised in East Berlin. His family had lived under the tight control of the Socialist Unity Party. His parents had always been observed closely by the authorities, as they were among those who wanted to make connections with the West and escape to the other side. Even before the wall was constructed, Friedrich and Lucas had found themselves in difficult situations, but they had always been together. They believed they could overcome anything as long as they were together. However, the day after the wall's construction began, everything suddenly changed. Friedrich's family decided to remain in East Germany. At that time, the East German government was determined to prevent any escape attempts. Many people who tried to flee to the West were willing to take great risks, even facing the possibility of death all across the wall. But Friedrich's family understood how dangerous and difficult that would be. For them, there was no other choice but to submit to the state's authority to protect their lives. Lucas, at that time, was a young man of only 19. He could no longer bear to wait to escape to West Germany. Unable to accept his family's decision, Lucas had started to look for a secret way to escape to West Berlin. That early morning, Friedrich's sister had told the family, "Lucas is going to escape to the West. I can't stop him no matter what." In Lucas's mind, there was only one thing: escape. As the days passed, Lucas's journey to West Berlin became a full-fledged escape. It was not just a geographical journey. The memories of the years he spent with his brother weighed heavily on him with each step he took. That day, they were both chasing a life that they had once only dreamed of. That day, they understood that nothing would ever be the same again. Friedrich and Lucas met one last time. In the ruined streets of the city, the two brothers looked at each other with intense emotions in their eyes, embracing each other one final time. Friedrich said, "You have to go to the West. This is your chance. You'll make it somehow." Lucas opened his eyes in fear but tried not to lose his courage. "But what about you?" he asked. Friedrich took a deep breath. "Don't worry about me. I'll stay here. But you, find the life in the West." And at that moment, the wall was truly built. However, a greater wall began to form in their hearts. Although it seemed like the end of everything, Lucas's determination in his eyes and Friedrich's fight for survival marked a turning point for both of them. The two brothers parted this way. The Berlin Wall would leave permanent marks on their lives as both a physical and emotional boundary. One would go to West Berlin, the other to East Berlin, completely separated from each other. It would no longer be possible for them to reach each other. The wall had separated the paths of the two brothers, and everything had changed. This was the beginning of a moment that would change not just Berlin's, but all of Germany's and even the world's fate. The Berlin Wall was more than just a wall. It was a barrier drawn between people, between societies, between families, and between friends. On that gloomy morning of 1961, Berlin would never return to the way it had been. That morning, the physical barrier that split the city was no longer just a wall made of concrete blocks, but a wall that shaped people's lives and charted their destinies. Friedrich and Lucas, dragged to different corners of Berlin, would only remind each other of their memories. However, over time, even those memories would begin to fade in the changing world. Lucas hoped to escape to West Berlin and start a new life. However, the reality wasn't as simple as he had imagined. As a young man searching for freedom, although he longed to embrace all the dreams promised by the West, behind the modern face of West Berlin, difficulties and obstacles awaited him. Despite being a city rebuilt after the war under the shadow of the Cold War, West Berlin felt the pressure of increasing the divide between East and West with each passing day. The West appeared to be under the influence of Western countries, seemingly offering promises of democracy, freedom, and media freedom. But the streets of the city were filled with a hidden sense of anxiety and fear. At first, Lucas expected to begin his new life in West Germany with much more ease, but he constantly carried an underlying concern for East Germany and his brother Friedrich. After spending a few weeks in West Berlin, he realized that life was not as simple as he had hoped. Even though those escaping from East Germany were accepted into the West, they often faced financial difficulties. Once Lucas found a place to stay, he quickly adapted to his social circle, but he was always overshadowed by his past, his family, and his bond with Friedrich. On one hand, there was freedom, but on the other, there was the loneliness of being detached from his roots. Lucas began to feel increasingly alienated from the people around him. He felt like just a refugee, just an escapee. In his mind, on one side were dreams of freedom, while on the other, the heavy burden of his past weighed on him. Lucas had also seized an opportunity. Using the media freedom in the West, he began searching for ways to contact his brother Friedrich in East Germany. This meant taking risks. Although the West promised freedom, those trying to escape from East Germany or establish contact with the West were secretly monitored and followed. However, Lucas was determined to reach Friedrich no matter the cost. Friedrich, on the other hand, was entering a world far different from the West as he stepped into his new life in East Berlin. East Germany was a place dominated by a communist regime. His family continued to live under the strict control of the state. Friedrich's daily life was shaped not only by the pressures of the regime, but also by the economic and social turmoil that East Germany was enduring. Even after the Stalinist era, East Germany was under significant political pressure. Friedrich, as an ordinary young man, had become a suspicious figure in the eyes of the regime. His every thought and every action, like all the other young people trying to escape to the other side of the wall, was seen as a threat. On one hand, his family struggled to survive under the regime's policies and the tight control in East Germany, while on the other hand, Friedrich had to think about his own freedom and future. He found himself in a deadlock. Although he refused to live the life dictated to him, in reality he had no idea what he could do, and he had to live in a silent resistance. At night, as he wrote letters to his brother Lucas in West Berlin, Friedrich questioned the meaning of freedom while also trying to cope with the struggles of his life. In his mind, there was always the same question: would escaping be the right choice? The risk of his family's survival and the constant threat of being detained by the secret police were becoming more and more overwhelming. But the hardest part for him was the growing distance between him and Lucas, not just geographically, but also emotionally. East Berlin had become a place of captivity for Friedrich. The roads and buildings seemed to separate him from everything else, and everything was woven with a sense of alienation. In contrast to his family's decision to remain loyal to the regime, Friedrich's inner desire for freedom was slowly growing into a rebellious fire. However, crossing that wall alone and chasing a dream had become an almost impossible task. Lucas's search for freedom in West Berlin and Friedrich's oppressive life in the East were deeply affecting both of them. Over time, both began to know each other only through the memories of the past and the letters they wrote. Although they were far apart, both of them still carried a common hope: freedom. However, it would take time for them to understand what these freedoms, promised by the West and East, truly meant for them. The Berlin Wall was much more than a boundary separating them. Every day they remembered each other as they continued down their difficult paths, on different sides. This journey became a struggle for two brothers, strengthening their bond, as they fought to protect each other and reunite. And as time passed on both sides of the wall, there were two people searching for their own freedoms but living in constant fear of losing each other. The construction of the Berlin Wall not only divided the city but also widened the distance between the two brothers. Each wall pushed the life behind it even further away. The love and longing Lucas and Friedrich felt for each other became more and more obstructed by the increasing restrictions, and their attempts to communicate became increasingly difficult. However, no matter how impossible it seemed, their struggle to not be torn apart would lead them on a journey that would ultimately make them stronger. In West Berlin, Lucas was not only facing the difficulties of building a new life, but was also carrying the growing concern for his family in East Berlin, especially for Friedrich. Living under East Germany's oppressive regime was becoming more and more dangerous with each passing day. Lucas felt guilty for losing more time with his brother each day. This guilt drove him step by step into action. The sense of freedom in West Berlin was always incomplete for Lucas, as not knowing whether his family and brother were safe no matter how much freedom he experienced kept unsettling him. He decided to use the power of the media and send information to the East through various secret channels, hoping to somehow reach Friedrich. However, this effort carried great risks. The flow of information between East and West was tightly controlled, not only for communication coming from the West but also for anything traveling from East to West. Lucas, constantly fearing capture, was aware of the dangers of trying to communicate and thus planned every move carefully. He began sending short, precise, and coded written messages instead of spoken ones. These letters might have seemed like ordinary ones, but each represented a form of communication that teetered on the fine line between life and death. Lucas never forgot to include encouraging words and hopeful expressions to uplift Friedrich, but with every line he wrote, he knew they were in danger. Over time, these threats would begin to materialize. Meanwhile, Friedrich in East Germany began to feel the tight surveillance of the Stasi. The secret police were not just watching people, but also questioning any opposing thoughts, foreign interactions, and connections to the West. Revealing his thoughts about West Berlin could put him in great danger. The Stasi took any form of contact with the West extremely seriously, believing that even a person's communication with the West could be considered an act of treason. Friedrich could not even open up to his closest friends about the longing and anxiety he felt for the outside world. The Stasi's networks were watching every word and every glance, and even a moment of relaxation could turn someone into a target. Every move Friedrich made was watched with suspicion, but there was something unseen by the outside world: his love and longing for his brother Lucas. To protect the safety of his family and friends, Friedrich had to keep his connection to the West hidden. However, cutting ties with Lucas, the brother he had once grown up with and shared everything, was becoming harder with each passing day. In his letters to Lucas, Friedrich conveyed the pressures he was under and his hatred for the regime, but always tried to remain cautious and controlled. One wrong word he wrote could mean the end for both of them. In these circumstances, Friedrich knew how risky it was to make any contact with the West, but at the same time, he was searching for a glimmer of hope. Unfortunately, due to the fear of the Stasi's surveillance, he could never fully express this hope to anyone. Knowing how dangerous it was to communicate through secret channels, Lucas began trying different strategies. After some time, a group of former East Germans living in the West began to spread across various regions of Europe. Among these people were some old friends of Friedrich's family. Lucas managed to contact them, and through these people he began searching for a new way to reach Friedrich. These individuals used various escape routes to move secretly and riskily between East and West. Lucas had long since passed the quiet life he had once lived away from the noise of West Berlin. Now, in order to help his family, he had no choice but to trust strangers. However, communicating and traveling placed him in increasing danger. These secret messages were crucial for Friedrich to not lose hope. Lucas, in every letter he sent, carried a message of hope, that the love and bond between them could transcend the distance. But at the same time, every line emphasized how careful they needed to be in the dangerous world they were living in. After all the dangerous processes, would the two brothers ever manage to reunite? The answer to this question would become a test of how strong courage, commitment, and a person's belief in love could be over time. The forbidden connections between Lucas and Friedrich brought them closer, but with every passing day, they also felt more and more the weight of the danger. The risk of being caught was ever present, and yet, in their letters to each other, both brothers refused to lose hope. Friedrich's difficult circumstances reminded him how valuable life was. Lucas, on the other hand, was willing to put his own freedom at risk in the West for his brother. These mutual sacrifices were strengthening the bond between them and making both brothers stronger. One day, Lucas finally found someone who secretly sent information to the East. Friedrich understood the critical nature of this letter, and for a moment he found hope again. But none of them knew that this journey would become a matter of life and death, and this letter might just be their last chance to reunite. The secret pathways through which they communicated became not only a glimmer of hope, but also a story of two lives still connected in the dark, telling the tale of an impossible bond. The distance between Lucas and Friedrich was no longer just geographical, but emotional as well, growing deeper each day. On one side of the Berlin Wall, there was freedom and hope, while on the other, oppression and darkness. Yet both held onto the hope of reuniting, determined to turn that hope into reality. But this was not only a matter of hope, it was also a test of courage. The escape plans were no longer just about their love for each other. They now involved the very struggle for survival. As Lucas tried to settle into his new life in West Berlin, he made more plans every day to reach his brother. Friedrich, under the tight surveillance of the Stasi in East Berlin, was in a perilous situation. But Lucas kept in constant communication with his contacts in the West and seized every opportunity. One day, an old friend from West Berlin offered Lucas a secret path that, though extremely dangerous, could lead him to Friedrich. This path was an underground tunnel that had been secretly built, known to only a few. Lucas believed this tunnel was the only way for Friedrich to escape from the East. However, using the tunnel was fraught with danger, and it was not a short passage. It could take several minutes to traverse, and every moment carried the risk of being caught. Lucas's escape plan had to be meticulously prepared. The tunnel was not just a passage. It was also guarded by several security measures. The goal was to get Friedrich from East Berlin to the West, but the ever-present threat of being caught by the Stasi made the plan incredibly risky. Before carrying out this plan, Lucas needed to send Friedrich some reassuring messages to let him know everything was ready. But again, this carried great risk. Meanwhile, Friedrich continued to live under the increasing pressure in East Berlin. The Stasi's surveillance was so tight that moving outside was almost impossible. Every step Friedrich took in his small world was carefully calculated. The Stasi didn't just watch him, they were constantly pressuring him. He was on alert all the time to understand the hidden messages Lucas sent him. Friedrich started to think that the escape plan was slipping further away because entering such risky situations was not easy. Yet, inside Lucas's messages, there was still a glimmer of hope. Friedrich thought his brother had found a solution, and the details of the plan increased his trust and belief in Lucas. But at the same time, fear grew inside him, knowing that the risk of being caught was ever present. Even if Friedrich managed to escape, how easy would it be for him to reach the West? Every moment carried both an opportunity and a threat, but he felt there was no other choice this time. For him, the path to freedom seemed like a distant hope, yet he had no choice but to make one final attempt. Lucas began preparing for Friedrich's escape. This journey wasn't just a dangerous crossing nor a short process. Though the tunnel stretched from East Berlin to West Berlin, every step within it was a matter of life or death. Lucas gathered all the necessary information for Friedrich's escape. He reached out to some of his old friends and smugglers near the tunnel to ensure everything was in place for Friedrich's escape. They would all work tirelessly to help Friedrich cross into the West. However, no one knew for certain whether they would succeed in the end. Friedrich decided to make his way to the area where the tunnel was located. This was his best chance to evade the Stasi's watch. One night, Friedrich, for the last time, surveyed the house where his family lived and decided to say goodbye. For him, this escape was not only a pursuit of freedom, but also a farewell to everything he was leaving behind. In that moment, he realized the enormous cost of this decision. Yet, despite everything, the hope of freedom and being reunited with his brother was far greater than anything else. The day the escape plan began, Friedrich approached the tunnel's entrance. Lucas, racing against time, checked everything to ensure Friedrich reached the right spot. Every move Friedrich made felt like a tense confrontation. The tunnel was dark and narrow. It was cold, airless, and gloomy inside. With every step, he took another risk. But as he progressed, there was a light at the end of the tunnel that promised him freedom. As time passed, he thought that perhaps he could change the course of Stasi's movements. However, once inside the tunnel, every step sent chills down his spine. Every sound in the dark posed a risk of being discovered. After a while, he saw daylight at the end of the tunnel. It was not just a step, but a turning point. He was indeed one step closer to freedom. But the journey was not over. Reaching West Berlin, just taking a breath at the end of the tunnel wasn't enough. Lucas had prepared all the details to ensure Friedrich's safety. However, there was always the possibility that the plan could fail at the last moment. The path Stasi was following meant that everything could come to an end at any time. When Friedrich arrived in West Berlin, he began walking toward the safe zone where Lucas was waiting. But this was only the beginning. The final step of the escape plan could eventually lead them to freedom and reunion. However, with each step came more danger, more risk. They were racing against time, giving one last effort. This escape that would change Friedrich and Lucas's fate was not just a transition from one place to another. It was the greatest test of their lives, a story of courage, belief, and freedom. Behind the wall created by the Berlin Wall, life had become darker over time. With each passing day, the distance between Friedrich and Lucas grew further apart. Every effort to reach each other only meant more pain and sacrifice. While Lucas built a freer life in West Berlin, Friedrich faced oppression, detentions, and all sorts of obstacles in East Berlin, which made their journey to freedom even more complex. The escape plans were a great risk for both of them. But nothing could be as powerful as what would bring them closer together. When Friedrich took the first step in his plan to escape to West Berlin, he knew that everything had to be done very carefully and slowly. Reaching the West via the tunnel was a move that required great courage. Lucas had given him a final warning from the West. Be very careful. Stasi could spot you at any moment. These words made Friedrich uneasy with each step. Yet, his faith in Lucas and freedom gave him strength. Unfortunately, as the escape neared its final stage, the pressure on Friedrich grew even greater. The Stasi in East Berlin had already started tracking him. One morning, while Friedrich was preparing, secretly and leaving his house, he was noticed. Stasi agents suddenly raided his house and arrested him. Friedrich's preparations for escaping to West Berlin were dashed, and when he was detained by the Stasi, he realized that his journey toward freedom had encountered a major obstacle. From that moment on, Friedrich's life began to spiral into a dark future, being interrogated like a criminal. Every step he took was filled with threats and risks, and he quickly began to lose hope of ever reaching West Berlin, as he sent his last message to Lucas. Right after Friedrich's arrest, Lucas decided to do everything in his power to save his brother. While he may have been living in freedom in the West, his brother's life was trapped on the other side of that dark wall. Lucas fearlessly took action. First, he considered approaching the West German government, but it was clear that this would not be effective. The fact that everything was in Stasi's hands made their diplomatic efforts futile. Lucas reached out to some of his contacts in the West, using especially old friends and those close to smugglers. He tried to free his brother through much more radical methods, outside of any diplomatic channels. While the West's government claimed they couldn't do anything about Friedrich's release, Lucas's inner rebellion drove him to seek other solutions. One day, one of Lucas's close friends said, "There's a way, but it comes at a great cost." Lucas was fully aware of this. No matter what the cost was, he was determined to go to the ends of the earth to save his brother's life. In that moment, Lucas began to take radical and dangerous steps in his quest to rescue Friedrich, without any hesitation. After his arrest, Friedrich was interrogated for a long time. The Stasi not only accused him of attempting to escape, but also questioned his thoughts, portraying his desire for freedom as a crime. Every word Friedrich spoke was seen as a betrayal in the eyes of the Stasi. The authorities, who tortured him during the interrogation, tried to break his spirit. However, Friedrich mentally maintained his resistance. The courage his brother Lucas had given him, the hope of freedom, and perhaps the belief that they might be reunited one day kept him alive. Months of interrogation had worn down Friedrich's body, but in his mind, the dream of reuniting with his brother kept him standing. The Stasi constantly accused Friedrich of trying to escape to the West, but each time he resisted by claiming that there was nothing behind his escape plan. With each passing day, his trust in his brother and his desire to reach him grew stronger. When Lucas saw that every attempt he made to secure Friedrich's release had failed, he realized that waiting any longer would result in their losing everything. At that point, he began to think of another solution. Some radical groups in the West were known for their strong stance against the Stasi and their mission to free people. Lucas decided to seek help from one of these groups. For several nights, he attended secret meetings in West Berlin. A good friend of his, Marcus, gave him information on various radical rescue methods. But these methods were very risky and dangerous. Lucas knew time was running out and felt that he had no other choice but to use these radical methods. The methods were aimed directly at overthrowing the Stasi. This would not only free Friedrich, but also strike a blow against the regime in West Berlin. Despite knowing how dangerous it was, Lucas decided once again to pay a great price for his brother. However, it was clear that this price would be very high. After months of interrogation, Friedrich was finally released. But his freedom came only after paying a heavy price. Lucas, through the risks he took and the choices he made, finally seized the opportunity to free his brother. But for both of them, freedom was far beyond their old lives and identities. They would share their long-awaited reunion, their pains, and their sacrifices years later. However, Lucas's radical decisions confronted them with a price they would always remember. Friedrich and Lucas were finally reunited, but the price they had paid had left deep marks. Their future would be shaped in the shadows of these decisions and costs, long before the Berlin Wall fell. The year 1989 was a turning point in Berlin's history. The Berlin Wall had been a painful reminder that had separated the two brothers and two worlds for so many years. Before that day, the Berlin Wall was not just a physical barrier. It was also a boundary where hopes and dreams were cut off, and the human spirit was tested. But in the winter of 1989, the long years of separation were on the brink of a change that would deeply shake both sides. After years of enduring harsh interrogations, torture, and loneliness, Friedrich finally regained his freedom. Lucas, on the other hand, had paid a heavy price to establish his own freedom and life in West Berlin. But when the Berlin Wall finally fell years later, they would be able to take one more step toward each other. However, before this reunion, the pains, losses, and experiences of the past awaited them. When Friedrich's eyes recalled the moment he regained his freedom, there was a sense of helplessness. His journey toward West Berlin was like an awakening. The years of pressure, torture, and loss had worn him down, leaving deep scars on his soul. But these scars had also given him the strength to hold on to life. When Friedrich gained his freedom, he had managed to move to the west before the Berlin Wall fell. That day, as Friedrich headed toward West Berlin, Everything had changed. The streets, the avenues, were different from the days he had spent there years ago. The city felt like it had been reborn. But there was a void in his heart. He wanted to see Lucas again, to bridge the gap between them, but tearing down the walls built by years of separation wasn't easy either. The lost years with his brother, the loneliness brought by the past, all weighed on him like a burden. Yet above all, there was one thing more important: the power of being together, of reuniting. He thought of Lucas. He hadn't seen the fight his brother had made for freedom with his own eyes, but now, in that moment of change, he was dreaming of their reunion. Lucas had grown accustomed to his life in West Berlin. "I have a job, my own apartment, I'm free," he would say, but there was still a sense of emptiness. During the years Friedrich was lost, Lucas felt as though something was always slipping away from him. Back then, in the face of freedom and the different world, his efforts to trace his brother's footsteps had always fallen short. Every letter he wrote to Friedrich, every night the hope in his eyes stirred, never met reality. Whenever he thought of his brother, he felt both a relief and a deep sense of being lost. Although Lucas had adapted to his daily life in West Berlin, he carried the dream of reuniting with his brother, of making up for the lost years in Friedrich's eyes. Then, one day, in the midst of the usual crowds and everyday life in West Berlin, the moment came. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, Lucas finally saw Friedrich. Years later, when they finally locked eyes, neither of them knew what to do. They looked at each other, standing still. The ambitions, losses, and pains of the past echoed in their souls within a few seconds. They embraced. There was a long silence between the brothers. They didn't know what to say or do. They could only feel each other's presence. Lucas said, "You're finally here," but his voice seemed to convey all the pain with those words. Friedrich took a deep breath. In that moment, he realized that everything had changed. Everything that belonged to the past had been erased in an instant. Only a real connection remained between them. "I don't know what to do with the weight of the past," Friedrich said, "but I won't lose you now." After years of separation, Friedrich and Lucas had found each other again and started piecing together old memories. The Berlin Wall was not only a physical barrier, but also a chasm that had once separated their hopes, their loved ones, and their lives. But now that chasm had been destroyed. Among the rubble of the wall, their reunion was not just a brotherly bond. It was also a symbol of rebirth. Both had lived in different worlds, had endured different pains. While Friedrich faced years of hardships and loneliness, Lucas had paid the price of freedom in West Berlin. But behind these sufferings, there was a unifying force, the love and brotherhood they felt for each other. Gradually, the trust between them began to rebuild. It wasn't easy to leave behind the weight of the past and start anew, but both brothers decided to forgive and forget. In the future, they would take steps to build a new life together, with each other's support. As time passed, the changes in Berlin deepened. After the fall of the wall, it was not just the physical structure of the city that transformed, but also the relationships between people. Friedrich and Lucas decided to start a new beginning together in the old city. Beginning a new life together meant new hopes and challenges for both of them. As Friedrich tried to adapt to his new life in West Berlin, Lucas was always there to support him. However, the shadows of the past always followed them. Still, each new day brought them more hope and strength. Everything they would do together was the last remaining piece of their lives. When the Berlin Wall fell, the reunion of the two brothers was not just significant for them, but for the entire world. Because this reunion was not only about two people finding each other, it was a demonstration of the power of people coming together after separations, barriers, and pain. Finally, as Friedrich and Lucas lived together, free once again, they began to trust each other once more. Healing the wounds of the past was not easy, but building a life together offered them a stronger bond.